All right, welcome back everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Right, so next up we have David Batch, who's talking through managing privacy risks proactively. What can we learn from the Privacy by Design Award winners? David is a National Privacy Practice Lead, say that 3 times, at CyberCX. Prior to joining CyberCX, David was a privacy partner at Deloitte Australia and has held senior privacy roles in industry, including those to establish the privacy function of 2 of the Australian major 4 banks, and the Asia Pacific Head of Privacy for State Street Corporation, the Principal Privacy Officer at the National eHealth Authority, and the AU and NZ Privacy Lead for Fox Interactive Media. Can we give a very warm round of applause for Mr. David Batch coming up?
Thank you, thank you. We've got a pretty intimate crowd here today, so I think I might start by asking who here actually has managing privacy as part of their remit day to day? Right, okay. So it's good to see that people that don't are interested in this subject matter, because what I would like to do at the right point is actually talk about the relationship between the two. I think I'm probably preaching to the converted to a bit, but if you don't have strong data hygiene, you can't have a good information security program. And part of good data hygiene is actually having good privacy practices in your organisation. If you don't know what you've collected, why you've collected it, who it belongs to, what you're doing with it, where it's gone, or how long you should be holding on to it for, then how can you develop a good information security program? And if you don't know those things, you don't have a good privacy program either. So having good privacy is fundamental to having good information security, in my view. Ask anyone who's had a ransomware attack. Anyone who's had a ransomware attack knows that the damage and the remediation timeframe in terms of dealing with notifiable data breach requirements and letting people know is 10 times bigger if they actually don't have good visibility of their data. So that's basically, why I think this subject matter is important at a conference like this. There are a lot of people that work in the information security area that have responsibility for privacy, but if you don't, I think everyone in the room needs to be a champion in their organisation. Now, a lot of what we're going to cover off today in this talk is outside the realm of information security on the face of it, but it's all part of good data hygiene, all part of good data privacy. So we're going to talk about what is privacy by design. So privacy by design is a set of principles that came out of Canada that underpins good privacy management. It's guardrails to go by. They're global. They're very much aligned with our current privacy law and privacy principles under the Australian Act. Our regulator actually endorses them and encourages their use. In fact, we had an event last week where we launched our research, and the Privacy Commissioner spoke at it and said privacy by design is fundamental to good privacy. So we'll talk a bit about that. And we also have a video of an interview I did with Anne Kavukian that I'll play straight after this, the founder of the Privacy by Design principles. I'll talk about our research methodology and findings. The research methodology is something that has become quite interesting because there was a little bit of a Twitter storm about it. And then we'll talk about the 2022 winners. And there were no social media brands in the mix, if anyone knows what I'm talking about. All right, so I think the first thing we need to sort of understand is the principles themselves. So principle 1 of the Privacy by Design principles is proactive, not reactive, preventative, not remedial. So this is about a lot of things, but largely about education and risk assessment and getting on the front foot with managing privacy. Some brands are really, really good at this. In fact, a large mobile phone maker have a really great document on their website, A Day in the Life of Your Data. It explains all the things that happen. Really, 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 really outstanding. Privacy as the default is the second principle. That, in a nutshell, is about opt-in, not opt-out. So, privacy is built in. It's not something you have to choose. It's given to you automatically. Number 3 is about embedded into the design. So is there a privacy management dashboard present? Is everything happening in, like if we're talking about a website, for example, is everything happening in there that should be in the design of the actual website itself? Full functionality, so not asking for information when it's not required to deliver the service effectively. End-to-end security, as stated earlier, you cannot have privacy without good security and vice versa in my view. Visibility and transparency. It's about having measures in place that make it easy for people to understand what is happening to their data. Privacy policies are the de facto means for that. I actually think they're bad. They're terrible in most cases. But there are some brands out there that have done some really interesting things in getting the message across in what's happening with your information. And user centricity, number 7, managing your privacy easy. That ties in very much with like the dashboards and what's the experience the user has when they go, in our case, in the research we did, to a website and actually want to take charge of their privacy. Okay, so I'm cheating a little bit because you've come here to hear people speak, but I'm going to play an interview that I did with Anne Kavoukian that we played at our event last week. Anne Kavoukian is one of the most notable people in privacy and security globally. She is the founder of the Privacy by Design Principles and runs the Privacy and Security by Design Centre in Toronto, Ontario. I thought it was such good content, I must reuse it with her permission. And so I'd like to play that now just to give you a bit more of a background into Privacy by Design. Dr. Kavoukian, thanks so much for joining us this evening and being a part of the first Australian Privacy by Design Awards dinner.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Kavoukian, you have one of the most impressive CVs of anyone who has ever worked in the privacy space globally. For those of us in the crowd this evening who've worked in the privacy space for a while, yours is a well-known name. For the benefit of all here this evening, though, and we do have a lot of people who are new to the field here tonight, I'd like to quickly run through your background, if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, so you're currently the Executive Director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Centre in Toronto, a Senior Fellow at the Ted Rogers Leadership Centre, and a Faculty Fellow at the Arizona State University Law School. You also have a PhD in psychology, specialising in criminology and law, which you obtained in 1980. But aside from what I already mentioned, and looking back at your CV, your list of notable achievements is incredibly long. So I'm just going to home in on a few. You're quite well known for being one of, if not the longest serving privacy commissioner in the world, holding the role for 17 years in Ontario.
I loved it.
Yeah. It's a long time. You're an advisor to the United Nations on privacy, particularly in relation to big data and AI. In 2011, you were named one of the top 25 women of influence in Canada. And in 2020, you were a recipient of the Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of your outstanding contributions to cybersecurity and privacy in Ontario. But I think all those things aside, I think it's fair to say you're best known, at least globally, for your role in the development of the Privacy by Design principles, arguably the best known privacy principles in the world. So, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I'm really keen to understand how you came up with the principles and the problems that you had identified with privacy management more broadly that these helped solve. Can you tell us their origin story?
Of course. When I was appointed privacy commissioner, I was delighted, of course, and I went to the office, and there was a brilliant set of lawyers in the office who were all about how to enforce privacy in terms of our privacy laws and regulations after a data breach or privacy infraction had taken place. And that's very important, there's no question. But see, I brought a different view to it because I'm a psychologist. I'm not trained just as a lawyer. The view I brought was I wanted something proactive. I wanted a model of prevention to prevent the privacy harms from arising. If we could do that, and then if then you apply the laws, and then you have multiple benefits, front, proactive, and afterwards. So literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, I created privacy by design. And then I had to, sell it to the lawyers in my office, which took a little bit of doing, but then they came around because I wanted to make it clear I wasn't opposing privacy regulations, privacy laws, not at all. I just wanted to minimize the number of actions that went to privacy laws. If we could prevent the privacy harms from arising, then you have a much better model. So they bought into it, and then we grew it. And it was wonderful. These things take time, but in 2010, it was unanimously passed as an international standard by the International Assembly of Privacy Commissioners and Data Protection Authorities. And then we kept having more successes with it. So I was delighted because, as you know, the number of massive privacy invasive actions have grown dramatically. Surveillance has grown. All of this has grown. So to the extent that we can minimize the harms to begin with, and, I always say, bake it into the code, embed privacy protective measures into the design of your operations so people can't forget to apply them. They're there. They're an essential component.
Awesome. So from your kitchen table to the world, I love it. And I also really like the point you make about the fact that, there's a lot of disciplines that can contribute to privacy. Your background as a psychologist, understanding, people. This is a human rights domain, a subject matter area. So, that's a really good point to make. I have seen, out there when people are advertising for privacy advisors that they want people with a legal background, and it's not necessarily, it's not the case. The understanding privacy is something that should be fairly universal. So it's really, really great to hear that story. And you did touch on, the fact that they've become a standard adopted by the authorities around the world. But how have the privacy by design principles shaped public policy more broadly around the world?
I referenced that they became a standard in 2010, but the biggest advance was when the GDPR came into effect, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, and they included privacy by design as part of the GDPR. That just took off because countries all around the world want to upgrade their privacy laws to become consistent with the GDPR so they can engage in business and trade without fear of reprisal. And so privacy by design grew dramatically. And it's been growing all along, but now it's been translated into 40 languages. And literally, not a week goes by when I don't hear from some jurisdiction. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I've been talking a lot to India and to Japan. Brazil has just introduced privacy by design as part of their law. So the communication just grows, and it makes me so happy in that a lot of people think you have to give up on privacy. There's just far too much technology surveillance taking place. People email me, and this one guy emailed me and he said, "Look, lady, give it a rest on privacy. That ship has sailed." I said, "Are you kidding me? Get another ship. You don't give up on privacy because it's more difficult to do. You have to bear down." And that's what I try to do, is make it clear to both companies and governments, privacy will work hand in hand with data utility, with security, with whatever you're trying to do with your business initiatives. You have to find a way to marry the two. It's not hard to do, and that's often what I consult on.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I'm a firm believer that good privacy is good business. Treating people with respect, treating their information with respect, giving them choice, I think that's good for business. But we are seeing brands around the world being rewarded for bad privacy practices if their stock market valuation is anything to go by, or at least making more money than it seemingly costs them to have bad privacy practice. Do you think the tide is turning there?
I do, because what I've noticed in the last 2 years, and all of the public opinion polls reflect this, Pew Internet Research, their survey 2 years ago, they found that 90% of those surveyed were very concerned about privacy. It's the highest it's ever been. 92% were concerned about loss of control over their personal information. That's huge. Those are the highest numbers I've ever seen. And that is becoming a consistent finding, that the public is getting so concerned about their privacy. And privacy, forms the foundation of our freedom. It's all about control, personal control relating to the use and disclosure of your personal information. If you consent to its release, be my guest. Do with it as you wish, but you have to involve the data subject. It's their personal information. Only they know if it's sensitive or not or whatever. So I found that communicating this to companies especially and saying, look, privacy can work to your advantage. I offer privacy by design certification with KPMG, and companies that have been certified for privacy by design have come back to me and said they love it. They said it's given them a competitive advantage over the other guys because it keeps the customers they have, and it attracts new customers, because customers want their privacy respected. And the minute you start doing that, you have a total win-win: data utility and privacy. We have to get rid of the stupid zero-sum mindset of either or, one interest versus another. That was so yesterday.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, obviously there is a net benefit for good privacy. Can you share any success stories where a well-known brand has implemented the privacy by design principles and what benefits they realized in doing so?
There was this wonderful biometrics company that has been actually bought out now. And what they did biometrics, but they ensured that the use of the biometric and to whom it was disclosed was approved, consented to by the data subjects, by the individuals. This became a huge success because biometrics, as you know, is the most sensitive personal information that exists, and you really want to retain control over it. So this company grew dramatically, and they were recently bought out by, I think, Audience Partners. But they were one example, and there have been so many over time, because what you're doing is you're not putting the brakes on what the company is doing on their business interests. You're actually enhancing them, and you're bringing more attention to the company. I often speak to companies, and when I often first go in there, I say, do you have a data map? And they go, huh? And by that, I mean, when the personal information is first collected from the data subject, often there is consent involved at that first interaction. But what often happens after that is the information flows throughout the company to different departments, different areas, and secondary uses are made of the information without the consent of the data subject. And that's when you end up losing privacy. So I always say, please instill a data map, follow the flow of the information, and if additional uses of the data want to be made, no problem, go back and seek additional consent. And it works beautifully.
Great. Yeah. Look, I think it just makes good sense, privacy by design. It transcends time. Those principles transcend time. They transcend, the variance in the rules that we have across the world. It's a really great standard to apply for businesses. I guess, in trying to sort of turn a business around from perhaps bad privacy practices, or, you're starting out fresh, talking to the people in the crowd here today, there are 7 principles. Are there any that you think are more important than the others? So if I can put that in a different way, if a company were to prioritize building these principles into their business, in what order would you suggest they do it? Or is that just a total misread of the whole, rationale?
No, it's not. It's all about being proactive. So the second principle is privacy as the default setting. That privacy should be the default setting in your operations. And in fact, the GDPR also includes that as well. And the reason it's so important is it doesn't expect customers or citizens to search through all the terms of service, to search through the privacy policy, finding the opt-out box that says, do not use my personal information for any purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection that I'm consenting to. We know people don't have time to do that. It takes hours to do that. Privacy as the default setting flips that on its head. It says to customers, to citizens, you don't have to ask for privacy. We give it to you automatically. It's the default setting. We are only permitted to use the personal information you give to us for the primary purpose of the data collection that you consented to. Beyond that, we can't use it for any other purpose. And if a secondary use arises down the road, we have to come back to you and seek additional consent. People love this. It builds so much trust. And as you know, David, trust is fleeting these days. It's just running out the door. So when you build privacy as the default setting and you build trust with your customers, they love it and they consent to additional uses that come down the road. That's what companies have told me.
Yeah, right. I'd just like to sort of, I guess, focus on something you said earlier, but also on that trust point you made just now. You know, in some cases, whether you trust a company or not doesn't necessarily dictate whether or not you'll seek out their services, particularly if they have a monopoly, you know. And in the digital space, there's obviously a few players that have, you know, all but a monopoly on the services they provide. You mentioned earlier that, you know, you've seen in a lot of the Pew research that, you know, more than ever, people are saying that privacy is important to them. But as a psychologist, you also see behaviors versus desires don't necessarily marry up. Are you actually seeing that people's behaviors are starting to change to match their desires for greater privacy? Because that's always been the kind of, you know, Alessandra Acquisi always says, you know, as that behavioral psychologist, that's the great sort of conundrum. Like, people want privacy, but the way they behave is completely different. Are you seeing that change?
It's merging. As I mentioned, in the last 2 years, there has been such a dramatic increase in interest in privacy and data protection. And it may be because there have been so many abuses that everyone is hearing about. There's been an enormous shift to people saying, I'm not going to do this. If you don't respect my privacy and protect it as I wish, I'm walking out the door. It's remarkable, not just online. You know, people still go to physical stores, and often you'll be asked for your postal code or something. And increasingly, people are saying no. That's what companies are telling me, that these requests for information that were routine in the past, no big deal, all of a sudden, hands down, no, we're not doing it. And so I have seen this change, which actually warms my heart, because the behavior has to match. It has to marry the intentions expressed. And that's what I'm noticing. And that is also what is leading to a change on the part of companies. Google, for example, last week, they've strengthened the privacy policies dramatically. They've added additional protections, and there are so many other companies like that. So I take great heart in that. I'm optimistic.
Right. And I think it's probably the same in the Australian market too. We tend to be a microcosm of, you know, what's happening in the US and Canada and other Western nations. So the trend is probably similar here. I guess that just really highlights that privacy by design, there's never been a better time to start looking at these principles as guiding, as guardrails for your data management, for your personal information management in a company. And thank you so much for your time today. That's all the questions that we had. I know everyone here tonight really appreciates you sharing your story, the origin story of privacy by design, and how it has influenced privacy globally in the last 30 years. Thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. And the last thing I'd like to say is to remind people about how important freedom is. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy. And freedom is so important. You know, my background, I'm Armenian, and freedom has always been very important to Armenians, having gone through the Armenian genocide and the stories I heard from my grandparents. Devastating. So don't give up on freedom just because it's more difficult. It doesn't matter. We can always get freedom. Don't look at the odds. Look at what we must have in terms of society, and what you want to transmit to your children. These are the things we need to preserve.
That's a very timely message. Thank you very much, Dr. Kavoukian.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So thanks everyone for watching that video. You've now heard from the founder of Privacy by Design. Every time you see this now, you'll be thinking of that interview, hopefully. Always great to chat with Anne. But what I'm actually here today to talk about is, you know, our research and the research that aligns to the Privacy by Design principles. For anyone that actually wants a copy of the research, you can go to this web link here. But why do we do this? I had a client ask me about 12 months ago, the Chief Digital Officer of a Big Four bank. What does good privacy look like from the consumer view? And I said, well, this, that, the other. I knew in theory what it was good, but she said to me, I want to know exactly who's doing what. And I was like, okay, well, that's a bit of analysis that I haven't done before. I can think of a couple of examples. So that was actually the inspiration for doing, this particular research across the brands in Australia, just to sort of get an understanding of who's actually doing privacy well. Took about 2 months because we looked at 100 brands across 11 industry sectors. Actually, it was slightly more than 100 brands. We chose the brands based on market share. We looked at market valuations. We looked at web traffic if it was a purely digital brand. And I think fairly sort of reasonably, in a lot of sectors, we got at least 90% of the market. So we didn't actually get a comprehensive view of the Australian market. We got a majority view, but also, importantly, one that we could manage with a small research team in a couple of months. The 11 industry sectors, I'll cover off in the next slide. We looked at the web applications for these brands. We did not look at their apps. And a lot of people said initially, but you should be looking at the apps because a lot of people engage with brands through the app environment now, which I thought was fair. But the app environment is very, very constrained by the actual operating systems they run on. So a lot of privacy choices are not made by the app or the brand, they're made by the operating system. So we thought web applications slightly better because it actually is a little bit more open, and how a brand behaves in that environment is probably a little bit more indicative of their approach to privacy, particularly when it comes to some of the bad things that they did. We looked at 145 attributes. Each one mapped back to one of the 7 privacy by design principles. So there was quite a few attributes by 100. And we developed a risk-based scoring model. So we determined which attributes were the most privacy-enhancing or privacy-reducing and scored them accordingly. From that, we crunched the data and we came out with some results. So this chart represents the sum of the normalised principal scores by sector. So as each normalised principle is a score out of 1, and there's 7 principles, the maximum possible score is 7. So the closer a sector's score is to 7, the more that sector embodies the ideal of privacy by design. Now, you'll see, there's at the industry level, there's barely a pass for a lot of industries. This is also because brands might be doing great things in the privacy space, but they're also doing bad things. And the way we measured it, they ended up cancelling each other out. And I'll get into what those things were in a minute. So by principle, you can see now. I hopefully you can see that from back where you're sitting. We've got telco, technology, transport and travel, media, banking and finance, food and grocery, government, retail, social media, property and utilities, health, fitness and leisure, and general insurance. Now, all this information is available in the report if you actually want to reference it at any point. But this is how they scored on each of the principles per industry. And you'll see there's a couple of laggards there. Social media brands did particularly poorly across the sort of various principles. But then you look at telco and technology, who did really well, which is interesting. We also see that banking and finance did pretty well, and government did pretty well, bar user centricity, which I think is most people experience with government at times. So our key high-level observations were, at the brand level, nobody got more than a C+. So if we were to equate it to the old high school scoring methodology, C+ was the best brand in the bunch. So the issue was that there was a lot of great things being done, but a lot of bad things being done, as I already highlighted, which actually probably drag brands down. So you've got one team over here on the left doing heaps of great privacy stuff, building great privacy stuff in the website, but then you've got the marketing analytics team over here on the right dragging it down. And sorry to anyone who works in marketing and analytics, but the usual culprits. Brands that were global did better. And we think this is because they're subject to greater regulation offshore, so the GDPR. Or if they operate in the US, they're subject to the FTC's much stricter, not stricter, I should say much harsher penalties. The greatest privacy fine ever given was to Facebook a couple of years ago, $5 billion US for the Cambridge Analytica scandal from the FTC. So people are reasonably scared of that regulator. Digitally native brands, and by that I mean the ones that don't have a bricks and mortar presence, that the way their primary, and in some cases their only means of engagement with the consumer is through the digital channels, they tended to score better as well. And brands from highly regulated industries like government, they have their own privacy code. We're talking banking and finance, general insurance, and even transport sectors. They did well as well. All right, so let's talk through some of the good behaviours. So one of the things we noticed that was not very common, but was still there with some brands, are one-click cookie banners that have you opted out of marketing and tracking by default. Now, we all hate cookie banners. I hate them. They came about as a result of the e-privacy directive in the EU, but they're there and they're probably there to stay. So a lot of cookie banners are actually designed in a way, which we call dark patterns. They frustrate or confuse you into giving consent, or they'll make you opt out of everything. So there were only a few brands that actually did that, but the ones that did were scored well. Well-designed, accessible, and easy to understand privacy preference centres. So that's where users can go and actually manage their privacy proactively without having to engage any further with the brand. We looked at a whole lot of different characteristics as to how they were built. Some of themselves were dark patterns, and we considered some of the ones we saw in social media, which are really there because the regulators have demanded it, to be so confusing as to be useless. Privacy policies that are written in plain English with high readability scores. So we used the Fleisch readability test on privacy policies. That's basically a test that looks at the language, the structure, the grammar, and will tell you what the average age of comprehension for that particular policy. And obviously the lower that age was, the higher the score they got. Now, we don't like privacy policies. They're a necessary evil. So we also looked at, what other means were brands using to convey the same messages. Did they also include them in foreign languages? Because anyone who's used Google Translate on a foreign privacy policy to convert to English will see it ends up being pretty much gibberish. So did they have them natively there in a foreign language? Did they have videos where they sort of structured into tiers, layered, that type of thing? Did they publish privacy impact assessments, or was there any evidence that they were conducted? Government did really well at this because they have to do it, but basically nobody else did. Privacy and security blogs that educate users and customers on how to protect their privacy and security. There were some brands that were really good at this, and I did mention there is a brand that, in fact, the winning brand, who I'll reveal later, that's very, very good at this stuff. Now, this is a negative, but it's the absence of pixels and browser fingerprinting that is likely being used to track individuals. Now, we know that browser fingerprinting isn't exclusively used for that purpose, but there is third-party research to suggest the majority of its use is purely for tracking of individuals. So whilst we didn't give that the same level of sort of negative score as other tracking technologies, we still saw it as a negative, and we did always look at it in context. We had our team from STA, our pen testers, do that piece of the analysis. Ease of access to your personal information and easy ability to change and update it was also something we looked at. High quality consent practices in the web app workflow. So again, were they asking you for consent at the right point? Was it right up front before they collected information, or were they asking you at different times when they were collecting sensitive information? So these are the types. This is not the exclusive list of everything, exhaustive list of everything we looked at, but that's some of the good behaviours we. An absence of privacy dark patterns. Again, a negative. Websites requiring personal information to deliver content where regulation doesn't require it. An example of this would be when you try and get some marketing material from a brand. They ask you for your name and address, an email address. There's lots of brands out there that weren't doing that, which was great. And I was so keen to get onto bad behaviours, I didn't realise I had a couple of good ones left. So, consent dark patterns. I think we've probably all been on websites where, they frustrate you. They keep on asking you the same question over and over and over and over until you agree or give consent, and then they never ask you the question again. We track that type of behaviour. That's considered a dark pattern because it just basically frustrates people into consent. It's not meaningful consent. Privacy policies that were hard to find or more than 2 clicks away from any data collection point was a downside. Now, most websites, it's in there in the footer. You should be able to get to it straight away. But some brands have, we think, purposely hidden their privacy policies. Policies that weren't compliant with the base level of the law. There was tons that actually fit that, and that was actually quite surprising. Tracking cookies, pixels, and browser fingerprinting. Now, this is actually what lets most brands down. The amount of tracking that goes on when you're on the web, it kind of blew my mind. Some brands had literally in the tens of cookies, pixels, and it's clear what they're trying to do is track your movement right across the web, not just within their website, externally. No clear way to access or change the personal information being held about you. This is actually one that social media was pretty good at. They're pretty good at giving you the information they have, again, enforced by regulators, so that wasn't their goodwill. But also we found the brands operating in the European market were very good at this as well because they're subject to the GDPR, the data portability rules. And they also have, I would suggest, stronger regulators over there as well. Okay, so the awards. Now, there's a lot of brands on here. These were our finalists, the top 5 from each industry sector. Now, as you saw from the results earlier, not every industry was equal. These were the brands that we decided were eligible for the awards. The awards were given across industry sectors, not to the top in each industry sector. There was, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of a discussion online about why are we recognising social media? We're not. They were just the best in the social media sector. So from this list, and is there anyone in the room from any of these companies? Has anyone seen their company up there? No? Okay. The winners, for the first 7, we gave out awards to the first, for the first 7 principals, or for the 7 principals. This was the list of winners. Apple, ABC, Airbnb, BP, and Uber Eats. Again, I think the presence of a lot of foreign companies on this list is due to some of the factors we described earlier. And the ABC, because I think they have a strong sense of social and ethical responsibility and are also dictated by government rules. So it's interesting. More regulated or more global brands were the winners for each principal. Top state government brand was Service New South Wales. They have, for anyone here from New South Wales, Victor Dominello, who is the minister for this particular department, is very passionate about privacy, and that really came through in a lot of their product. Top federal government, controversial because we included them in government and media, was the ABC, but they were outstanding. Top Australian corporate was NAB. They've been on quite a journey, I believe, to uplift their privacy and data ethics and are leading the pack in Australia for Australian companies. And the overall winner was Apple, which I don't think comes as a surprise to anyone who knows much about privacy. Apple have been using privacy as a point of difference in the market. Whilst they still have a lot of room for improvement, they were the top brand, C+. So yeah, and just for fun, at the awards evening last Thursday night, here are our keynotes, some of our keynote speakers: Julie Eamon-Grant, the eSafety Commissioner; Jane Horvath from Apple, who came out from California to speak at our event, and the Privacy Commissioner as well. So So yeah, that's what we learnt from our research. There's a ton more information in the report, and if you are interested in this, I definitely encourage you to download it. We are keeping the findings at industry level. Other than the brand winners, we're not mentioning the brand's performance. But if anyone does work for a brand out there that we looked at and wants to know more, please reach out. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Excellent, thank you. Right, now, there was one question online, just while people kind of lock and load their questions in here. What companies do you believe are doing privacy well, especially in terms of the way they are transparent and innovate in the way they communicate privacy and data protection?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that question may have come in before we saw the winners list, but yeah, Apple are actually outstanding at this. They communicate what they're doing really, really well. And you do get a sense from them that it's not regulator enforced, it's actually genuine. We do see believe it or not, the social media brands are actually reasonably good at communicating what they're doing in the privacy space. But I think it's a little bit of lip service. It's there obviously to address a key risk for them. But whether or not that actually converts into action, and we saw on their websites it didn't really, is another thing.
Excellent, thank you. Were there any questions in the room? Right, no hands up. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
We have another round of applause for David Batch. I do have a dad joke if you want to hear one about privacy.
Yeah, go on.
This is just between us, everyone. Did you hear that Pirate Bay changed their privacy policy?
No.
They are GDPR compliant.
Good dad joke. Thank you. No, cheers. Thank you.